Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we will be exploring mystical Christianity. With me is Richard Smoley, who is the editor of Quest, the journal of the Theosophical Society in America. He is also past editor of Gnosis magazine, and he is the author of many books, including Hidden Wisdom, The Guide to the Inner Traditions, and Inner Christianity, The Guide to the Esoteric Tradition. Also, Conscious Love, Insights from Mystical Christianity, and How God Became God, what scholars are really saying about God and the Bible. Welcome, Richard.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you also. Mystical Christianity, it almost seems redundant in the sense that from its very beginnings, Christianity was something of a mystery religion.
Yes, in many ways. But as Christianity became the dominant religion of Western civilization, it began to take on more and more external forms that hardened, and doctrines that probably Jesus and the apostles would not have even recognized or understood. And this enormous artifice was constructed. And when you do that, as with any civilization, the inner pith of the meaning, the actual inner truth of it, can be buried.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly over thousands of years, that's likely to happen in any religious tradition, and probably non-religious traditions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fairly obvious why, if you think about it. At the early stages of a religious movement, at least ideally, the people who are running things or guiding things are people with, shall we say, a certain amount of spiritual knowledge and maturity, because that's why they have those senior positions. But when a religion becomes very, very successful in the outside world, as happened with Christianity, it becomes very powerful, and positions of authority attract people who are interested in power. So sooner or later, the people who are running things are people who are mostly interested in power, which, unfortunately is pretty much the way things are today. But in a religious context, it means anyone who might actually know something about the spiritual side of it is going to be in a sense, pushed aside and sidelined. And that is, in a way, the history of Christianity over the last 2,000 years.
Well, as a non-Christian, when I think of Christianity, if I had to use one word, that would be love. I get the impression that at its heart, Christianity is a religion of love.
Yes, I would say so. But then, of course, you're faced with the contradiction of the fact that an enormous number of things are not loving in Christianity. And in recent years, the world is actually somewhat shocked to see a pope that actually seems to have read the Sermon on the Mount. And obviously something was askew here.
Yeah.
But I think, in essence, that's the case, that Christianity is about love, and it's about the relationship of self to other. In my book, Conscious Love, I talk about, well, what is love? And in the book, I suggest one answer. Obviously, there are many, which is it's what unites self and other. So that which, in a sense, draws us together, which unifies us. Obviously, this can happen in many different ways, in many different forms. There are different types of love. Some of them more transactional than others, but that's fundamentally what it's about.
Well, we began our interview with the topic of mystical Christianity. We've talked about love, and you've talked about love is that which brings us together. That's what mysticism is, essentially. It's the idea of unity, that there is no real separation, that separation of any kind is an illusion.
Yeah. At least on a certain level. Now, separation on the physical level is not an illusion. What does that mean? It means like, I get the girl, you don't. You get the job, I don't. We are not one in any ostensible sense.
Right.
But here's kind of the paradox. There is something in us that is eternal, and I would say it is that in us which says I, capital I. And it doesn't take a lot to have access to this, but it takes a little something. And the whole point is that the further you go into this I, the more it becomes an I that is we. So that what's most deeply and innerly you is also that which you have in common with everybody else. Now, just to say that is a way of saying, yeah, this actually requires at least a little bit of mystical insight. Otherwise, it's just a nice bunch of verbiage.
Yeah.
I think many people understand this. A lot of people, the most loving people in the world, the kindest and most compassionate, understand this intuitively, whether they may be able to formulate it in words or not. But I think that's something that, shall we say, all loving people have in common to some degree or another.
Well, within Christianity, I get the impression that because it became hardened, it became the state religion of the Roman Empire and a very, very powerful social force. The Pope became superior to kings and emperors, that there needed to develop a counterbalancing force. And these were various esoteric and mystical traditions within Christianity.
They were. And what they were, not necessarily even counterbalancing, but keeping kind of the essence of it alive. But to view it the way you just suggested, there is a long-standing old tradition of two churches. And I don't mean two denominations, but two churches. One is the Church of Peter, and Peter has always, in esoteric Christianity, symbolized the external religion. Peter is the one who is the shall we say, the rock, but he's also sort of dense, is portrayed in the Gospels. Then there is what is sometimes even called the secret church of John. John is associated with the esoteric side, the deeper, inner side. And I believe in one of the Gospels, when Christ is risen, Peter gets there first and John comes after him. And esoterically, that means that, well, yeah, you do have to go through the stage of exoteric outer faith, but then, to get closer into it, you need to have that Church of John. Now, I am not, by the way, saying that any sort of secret Church of John exists or does not exist. That's a completely different question. It's a question of different levels of understanding.
But what you're talking about is the distinction between exoteric and esoteric.
And how to put it as simply as possible? Well, there's a level at which you follow the rules and you do all of it kind of just because I said so. And then there's a level at which you do it because you see the inner reason for it. It's not all that different from childhood versus adulthood. The child, you do that because I say so. The kids, usually because the adult has superior force, but you do that because you say so. I say so. The kid becomes mature, becomes an adult himself. He sees why he was told to do that. He understands. And that, in a sense, is the difference between the exoteric and the esoteric.
Well, in Judaism, I'm sure you know, because I know you've studied Kabbalah, they talk about the Torah of the tree of knowledge of good and evil as opposed to the Torah of the tree of life.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a very similar distinction.
It is. Well, and that image of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which goes back to a myth that is still a topic of vital interest in our society. Mm-hmm. Well, what is to eat of the fruit of the knowledge, tree of knowledge? Mm-hmm. Well, if you really think about it, it means you want to know what good and evil is like, are like. And they eat this fruit, and how are they punished? Because no one talks about hell in the book of Genesis.
Right.
Yeah, all right, well, you wanted to know what good and evil is? Mm-hmm. All right, you're going to have to go down to a level where you have to work hard for a living, so you eat, and where it hurts to have babies, right?
Yep.
That's all it's really saying. And the sweat of thy brow, in travail shalt thou give birth. Mm-hmm. You wanted this. You wanted to know what good and evil like. All right, here is the world of good and evil. And I will say this about you. I will say this about anyone who happens to be listening to this. This is a categorical truth about anyone who could possibly ever listen to this. You have known some good and some evil in your life. That is unquestionably the case.
I think that's a fair statement.
Some seem to know a lot more than others of one, and the reasons for that are interesting. Mm-hmm. But everyone tastes good and evil.
Here in the physical plane, in the human embodiment, that's the way it works.
Yeah. And so that starts to explain a little bit about the problem of evil, because it's like, well, this is part of the dimensions of the world we have chosen to experience. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much like, well, is this some horrible, ghastly, deviant thing, or, but it's not all, sunshine and jello either.
Mm-hmm. And I gather in the Jewish tradition, the Torah of the tree of life is limited. It's reserved for people who have already more or less mastered the other Torah of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That you have to start there.
Yeah. Well, the image of the tree of life is universal, as you know, and one of its meanings is very much like this, I think. There is one tree, but there's a multiplicity of branches, leaves, fruit, and so on. Mm-hmm. So there's a multiplicity, but there is an underlying unity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why, apart from the fact that trees themselves are universal, that's such a universal myth or image.
Mm-hmm. To jump back to the topic of mystical Christianity, there have been some interesting movements within Christianity. One of the most intriguing to me has been anthroposophy, the movement founded by the Austrian mystic Rudolf Steiner. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Rudolf Steiner lived, he was sort of basically around the turn of the 20th century, and he was certainly a great visionary, and he was incredibly productive, and the Waldorf School of Education, biodynamic agriculture, all sorts of other, really quite creative movements came out of his thought.
Yes.
And he was kind of interesting in that he seemed to want to limit his inquiry to that of the purely human level. That is to say, not only just in a physical sense, social sense, but the inner structure of the human. Steiner, curiously enough, actually says fairly little about God. He does talk about Jesus. He does talk about archangels, but God himself or itself is a fairly remote figure for Steiner.
Yes.
And another thing about Steiner that's interesting is that he tends to personify universal forces. There is a force, shall we say, that keeps us drawn down to this world. There's nothing else but this world. Say materialism. Now for Steiner, this force is personified, and he calls it Ahriman after the Zoroastrian. His usage is not the same, but that's his
similar,
name.
Yes.
It's similar, but and Ahriman is Ahriman is great about teaching about technical knowledge, but Ahriman has also shackled you to belief in the material world and to belief that nothing but the material world exists. And Steiner said that, you know, as time went on, the power of Ahriman would get greater, which certainly seems to have done in the century since he lived. The other figure was Lucifer, who kind of pulls you out and, you know, in a good sense, elevates you, in a bad sense, kind of tends to make you airheaded.
Lucifer, in some traditions, is equated with Satan, but that's not how Steiner meant it.
No, he does not. And, you know, what Lucifer really meant, I mean, the one or two times the name appears in the Bible, it's a figurative name for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. How art thou fallen? It's a rather poetic usage.
Doesn't it also refer to a being of light?
Being of light. It means light bearer. Another kind of more pragmatic, down-to-earth meaning is it's the planet Venus.
The morning star.
Yeah, because you know, you see Venus, you know, often before sunrise.
Well, as I understand Steiner's writings, Lucifer represents artistry, passion, beauty, everything but love, which is sort of reserved for the Christ figure in his cosmology.
Yeah. Well, you'll see this in a lot of different traditions. And as I say, Steiner expresses this personalistically, right? These are beings, cosmic, superhuman beings, but beings. And Lucifer is the ascent. Ahriman is the descent, and Christ is the reconciling force that has to balance these two. And these are, you know, not only beings, but forces that we ourselves have to integrate within ourselves. Other people, like G.I. Gurdjieff, an equally powerful spiritual teacher, tended to talk about them as forces, the wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling force. You know, you can see a lot of these things that are, shall we say, beyond our ken. Even God himself, I would say, can be viewed either as a person and experienced as a person, or as something quite impersonal. Because if God is as big as God must be, both means of expression are likely to be there.
Now, your book, Conscious Love, Insights from Mystical Christianity, borrows a phrase from Gurdjieff.
Yes, and Gurdjieff does speak of conscious love. And he has a rather enigmatic series of lines that says, conscious love evokes the same in response. Love of feeling evokes the opposite. Love of body is dependent on type. Now, what does that mean? Well, starting at the bottom, type is fairly obvious. What does it mean? Well, she's not my type, right? He's not my type. Everybody knows what that is. Even if you can't articulate why this particular person is or isn't, yeah, it's your type. Love of feeling evokes its opposite. Well, I mean, it turns out, as we've all discovered in our own sad little ways, the more emotionally needy you are, the more pathetic you seem, and the more the other person's going to want to run in the opposite direction. Normally, ordinarily, frequently. Conscious love, you are actually aware of yourself as a being and the other person as a being, you know, who has, is, shall we say, not only love but respect, and it's going to evoke the same in that person. Now, one of the great themes of my book, Conscious Love, is that a great deal of our ordinary love, as we think of it, is quite transactional. It's definitely a tit for tat, and it should be. But conscious love, or what the New Testament calls agape, is above all that. It is unconditional love. Now, it would be very cynical and also incorrect to say this unconditional love does not exist, but I think it is reasonable to say it's a bit rarer than people like to pretend. And is your love for family transactional? Well, it hardly seems so. They're your family. You love them anyway. But what is every holiday season but a reckoning of accounts between different family members, usually unpleasant.
It can often be that way, I guess.
Frequently.
Yeah.
So, hey, this is not supposed to be transactional, but yeah, it is. Why, you gave her a bigger gift than me, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Or, you didn't do this for me when I was 10, but you did it for her, the whole routine.
Yeah.
So these kinds of love, they're not evil. They are a bit more conditional than we often like to pretend. And the only thing I'm saying is really that, let's just be a little more honest with ourselves about which is which.
But the idea of agape or agape is a higher form of love that is exemplified, if I understand it correctly, in the life of Jesus.
Yes. And this is striking because Jesus in the Gospels is not exactly a warm, fuzzy, huggy kind of guy. He's actually rather impersonal, sometimes remote, sometimes sharp. He always does the right thing, and he always does the kind thing. And his ethical teachings are kind of the very highest caliber. But he's not the kind of guy who goes slobbering around everybody saying, I love you, pal, I love you, pal. And I think that really ought to teach us something about what agape really is. And a lot of the showiness of it is maybe a little bit false.
It's not necessarily the same thing as New Age, kumbaya, if only can't we all get along? And yet, we do need to all get along.
Yeah. Well, the ethical commands of Christianity are clear. By some miraculous coincidence, they're basically identical to the ethical commands of all the other great religions. Why? Because these are the things that have been proved to work over thousands of years of existence. If you follow these rules, you will have a happy society, and you will be a happy member of a happy society, or at least a more or less content one. If you don't, you're going to end up in jail, or else.
Well, what you're suggesting here, if I understand you correctly, Richard, is that mystical Christianity isn't all that different from mystical Judaism or mystical Buddhism or mystical Hinduism or mystical Islam.
No. And in fact, there was a Christian sage, I think of the 8th century, named the Abbot Dorotheus, who described it a bit like in the form of a circle, right? The exoteric religions are all on the rim of the circle. A point here seems very far from a point here. But these all have lines that go into the center. At the center, they all meet, and the closer they get to the center, the closer those points seem to be. And again, it's the idea that the mystics are often closer to one another, even though they're of different faiths, than they are to the what the Gospels call the scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites of all faiths. Jesus was not talking about just the religious authorities of his own day, I would humbly offer. There are scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites today. I'm not naming any names. And we all have these inner hypocrites as well. There's something about us, the ego, there's something insincere that you better see. You're defeating yourself if you're going to beat yourself up too much about it. But you better see it, and you better know that it's there, because you're going to have to work around it.
Well, as a non-Christian, when I think about mystical Christianity in the context of the world's mystical traditions, it strikes me that it's sort of centered at the heart chakra.
Yeah, and that's that's certainly where people experience their emotional center. Now, it's a very, very curious thing about this difference between the head and the heart, because cognitively, correct me if I'm wrong, most people locate their eye, capital I, in the head.
Yes, right between the eyes.
Yes. Now, when C.G. Jung, the psychiatrist, was traveling in the southwest U.S., he met some Indians, and they said, you know, the Indians said, the white men are very, very strange. You know, they think they're up here. And Jung said, well, where do you think you are? So maybe in a more, shall we say, primitive time, people really experience themselves as there. We experience ourselves as here. I don't know you're going to change that, you know, necessarily with a snap of the finger, even with a couple of workshops. But, you know, there is something here that also has to be acknowledged and felt.
Interesting. That's a fascinating story. It suggests to me that the very process of cogitating, which is so much part of modern life, puts us right in there. And maybe, well, I'm sure in the mystical Christian traditions, there are various exercises and practices for centering one's consciousness more in a heartfelt way.
Yes, and one thing you may be referring to is what is called the prayer of the heart. And this was developed in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. The earliest descriptions of it go back to, I believe, the 5th century. I'll tell you, and it's associated with what's sometimes called the prayer of Jesus. But I'll give you the original version, the oldest version from a saint named John Cassian, who heard it when he was learning these things from an abbot, a monk. It's actually a verse from the Psalms. O God, make speed to save me. O Lord, make haste to help me. That is the original version. It's the opening verse or version of it from the 70th Psalm, I think. It's a little later on, it's sort of mutated a bit. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the practice was simply to say this over and over again so that it became, as it were, part of your autonomic system, and that it was, this prayer was kind of repeated mechanically with the heartbeat. We're talking about, you know, years of intense discipline. We're not talking about, you know, just trying it for a couple of minutes. I like the older version better because it's, you know, it's purer. There is the divine, there is God. There's me, however I experience myself to be. And let's have some help, you know, because frankly, we all feel we need help, at least I do. Later on, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. Well, am I a sinner? You know, what is the theology of Son of God? You know, that kind of thing. It's a lot easier, in my view, to have your mind trip over all of that than it is in the older and what I would say is more pure form.
Well, we're out of time, Richard, but this has been very enjoyable. Thank you so much for sharing, especially the prayer of the heart.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
And thank you for being with us.